The infamous U.S. military prison in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, still open after 20 years. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. In response to the al-Qaeda terrorist attacks on the United States in September 2001, the U.S. launched what it called a war on terror. Hundreds of men suspected of terrorism were rounded up in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and other countries. They were sent to the U.S. military prison in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Many accused the United States of torturing them while in detention there, and most of the almost 800 detainees have since been released without ever being charged or facing trial. But despite repeated calls for the facility to be closed down, it is still in operation today, now 20 years after it opened. We begin with one of its former prisoners, Mansur Adayfi. He was a Yemeni teenager living in Afghanistan when he was taken prisoner by the Americans. He then spent 14 years locked up in Guantanamo, but was never charged and never tried for any alleged crime. He is now living in Serbia and is the co-author of the book Don't Forget Us Here, Lost and Found at Guantanamo. Mansoor Adayfi, welcome back to the show. Great to have you with us again.
Thank you for having me again, and thank you again.
You're welcome, sir. When we talked with you before, you told us that you were captured and handed over to the Americans for a bounty. You were a teenager, a Yemeni teenager at that time. You were in Afghanistan. Can you tell us what happened?
So basically, after 9/11, what happened with me, I was in Afghanistan on research mission. I was a research assistant at Afghanistan. I was kidnapped by one of the warlords, sold from one lord to another, then to Americans for bounty money. And as we mentioned last time to that Seton Hall University report and ACLU, that 80% of detainees who were in Guantanamo or prisoners at Guantanamo were either mistaken identity or sold for bounty money. And even Dar Rumsfeld himself admitted that he said most detainees at Guantanamo, dirt farmers. Basically what they did, they came to Afghanistan, and also the men who were in Guantanamo, they weren't in the battlefield holding guns fighting with the Americans. 50 nationalities, those men were brought from different parts of the world, from Afghanistan, Pakistan, United Arab Emirates, from Bosnia, from Mauritania, from Jordan, from different parts of the world. So basically, like many cases, I was swept there, sold to the Americans for bounty money, and like spent some time on the black side, then shipped to Guantanamo, where I spent around 15 years without any rights or trial or accusation or charge.
As you know, many of those who were captured by the Americans were interrogated, they were abused at US-run sites, at so-called black sites as well. That is before they were shipped to Guantanamo. What happened to you? Where were you first held, and were you abused in any way?
Yes. I mean, the first time I was shipped, I was taken, so when I was sold to the Americans, handed over as Al-Qaeda commander and 9/11 insider, and I was accused to be an Egyptian general. And I was, I spent around over 2 months in the black site. Like I lost my mind, basically. I mean, 24 hours interrogation, non-stop, beating, hanging, all kind of things you imagine. I mean, I don't want to go through it, but if you look at the Senate tertiary report, everything was mentioned there. It got worse for the group who came to the black site after us. And after over 2 months, I was transferred to Kandahar detention. Again, the machinery of interrogation starts again. Then to Guantanamo, the next 15 years there, under interrogation, torture, abuses, and so on. The narrative, however, changed in after 2010. In America, in the government report about me, they said unclear if he actually joined Al-Qaeda, and none of Al-Qaeda members or Al-Qaeda leaders recognize him as member of Al-Qaeda. This is Guantanamo, and as you know, like around 800 men in prison at Guantanamo. They don't call us prisoners; they call us detainees for some reasons, because as you know, they don't want to give us any rights at Guantanamo.
Now, it's been 20 years since the prison at Guantanamo was opened, and you arrived there actually very early. You've described your experience there, and I'm quoting you here. You say that experience there represents 20 years of injustice, torture, abuse, lawlessness, and oppression. Can you tell us why you describe Guantanamo in that way?
Yeah, today marks the 20th anniversary of Guantanamo. 7,306 days of the opening of Guantanamo. 20 years of injustice, 20 years of torture, 20 years of abuse of power, 20 years of oppression. This is Guantanamo, basically. Guantanamo is an idea and a place that created outside of the justice system. So basically, why I describe it that way, because it's the way it is. This is Guantanamo. I mean, men have been cleared since 2009, around 18, some of them men cleared, and they're still there, indefinitely detained. And there is no signs that will leave Guantanamo soon. Last year, we sent a letter to Mr. Biden, an 8-point plan to close Guantanamo, and we haven't seen anyone who is appointed for the closure of Guantanamo or to handle the transfer, clear the prisoners.
I know it's difficult for you to talk about some of these things, but when you were taken initially to Guantanamo, did the interrogations continue? Were you abused in any way? Were you tortured? Did you have any rights at all?
As I told you, that what they call us detainees, that what they call it rendition, that what they call it enhanced interrogation technique, that what they call it war and terror. When you come to look at these words, they constructed those words to create some kind of realities, then created some kind of legalities for these realities, which is war on Muslims. As Muslims, it is war of terror, not a war on terror. And the rendition, it is actually kidnapping. Enhanced interrogation technique, they call it it is actually enhanced torture technique. Detainees, they call us detainees because it is like prisoners. So that was because they made sure that no one had a right at Guantanamo. And Americans actually criticizing Cuban government for violating the human rights. And for the last 20 years, America commit one of the biggest human rights violations in the 21st century on American and Cuban land. So yes, Guantanamo actually was created intentionally out of the justice system, so they can go as far as they want. There was no right, there was no trial, interrogation over and over again, torture. Especially the torture was intense, and Guantanamo basically turned to be an experimenting lab. Guantanamo turned to be America's battle lab, experimenting on prisoners at Guantanamo. This is Guantanamo. We went through torture, psychological, mental, physical, sleep deprivation, there was waterboarding, sexual assault. They were experimenting basically on us how to interrogate and to extract information, how they wanted, it was the perfect place for experimenting because from the military perspective, Guantanamo was the perfect place for the military minds because Americans thought we were going to go with war with Muslims for next maybe 150 years. So they have a good sample to study them, to examine them, to experiment on them.
What do you make of the fact that nobody's been held accountable for this?
Yeah, I mean, this is what we are fighting. We're fighting for justice for Guantanamo. We're also fighting for the justice for American justice system that have been misused and abused. We haven't seen any justice. We haven't seen any accountability. We haven't seen justice for the prisoners at Guantanamo to get released. Innocent men, proven innocent men. Their innocence, your innocence removed as soon as you wear the orange color. You are, by default, as a Muslim, you are a terrorist. So saying accountability, I didn't know if you were going to see, if ever we're going to see accountability, basically. So we haven't seen, we are asking for the closure of the detention and release of the prisoners. And we told them if anyone who commit a crime of accusatory crime should be sentenced and prosecuted, and stand before justice.
As you say, the attitude from the authorities was that if you're Muslim, you're a terrorist. Now, as you point out, 800 men were held at Guantanamo. Most of them were of the Islamic faith. They were Muslim. How did your captors deal with that? Because there have been reports that the religion, Islam, as well as the holy book, the Quran, was disrespected.
Yes. One of the things that we need to, since we encounter American soldiers in Kandahar, in black site, everywhere, intentionally the faith, the Quran was used as a tool of pressure on detainees to confess, to cooperate with interrogators. But it worked other way around, because when that happened, we started protesting. We actually stopped talking to the interrogators, and it was happened over and over again in the interrogation room, in the cell block. It was a way of experimenting, a way of making pressure, a way of torture too. Stopping people from praying, or not giving them food while they're fasting, or taking the Quran, stepping on it, or throwing it in the toilet, or writing words on it, peeing on it. Many. One of the biggest issues we fought at Guantanamo was the religious issues. When it comes to pray, when it comes to Quran, and that had been over and over again.
Now, you were never charged, you were never put on trial. How were you eventually released, and how did you end up in Serbia?
I was sold to the American for money, as you know, and again, the American pay money for the hosting countries to take some of us. Basically, I was sent to Serbia against my will, because I didn't want to go to Serbia. I wanted to go to a country, an Arabic country, same culture, religion, culture, and language, and so on. Because going to somewhere, into a country which I didn't know nothing about it, especially the Serbian history with Muslims, I was afraid to come to Serbia. But I was told you have no choice. I mean, you are going to be sent there anyway. So basically, I mean, Guantanamo is upside down world. This is Guantanamo. I mean, I feel so sad today. 20 years, 20 years, and what I'm shocking, the international community. I mean, there is no pressure from those countries to pressure the United States to close that detention. It's not about Muslims, about us as human. It's not about us humanity, because now Guantanamo becomes symbol of torture, injustice, and so on. And it gives some kind of legitimacy to other countries to do the same.
You say you are in Serbia against your wishes, and I was wondering, has your imprisonment at Guantanamo impacted other parts of your life, like getting a job, or getting married, or starting a family?
See behind me, it's life after Guantanamo. I did my research about life after Guantanamo. My thesis, I graduated last year from university. My thesis was about rehabilitation and reintegration of former Guantanamo detainees. And, one of the shocking results there was really kind of rehabilitation and reintegration of those prisoners. And yes, there is a lot of difficulties and challenges. Some of the prisoners end up in prison. Again, after they were so after were they sent to a country, Spain, a state like to the United Arab Emirates. The prisoner, the Yemeni, 18 Yemenis and 3 Afghanis and 1 Russian spent 5 years. They were released only like 2 months ago. They were sent to United Arab Emirates as part of the resettlement agreement between the United States and the United Arab Emirates, but they were in prison. Some of the detainees ended up losing their life because there wasn't any kind of health care. Some of the prisoners were sent, like, for example, in Senegal, they were sent to Senegal, then they were deported back to Libya, where they were imprisoned and tortured again. Some of the prisoners live in limbo, no legal status, no access to health care, no education, no jobs, and also living in the stigma of Guantanamo. It's really hard to get married, to get a job, or even some of the faculties refuse to admit to let some of the prisoners to rule or to study because Guantanamo.
Mansur Adafi, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I would like to say one word. I mean, I demand that President Biden close Guantanamo, and it's a simple message for President Biden. Please close Guantanamo. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being with us, sir. And now, for more on the notorious U.S. military prison in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, I'm joined from New York by Brian Becker. He is the executive director of the anti-war group, the Answer Coalition. And also joining us is journalist and commentator Aaron Maté. He is the host of Pushback with Aaron Maté on the Grayzone. Welcome to both of you. Brian, let me start with you. We know that a number of those who ended up in Guantanamo actually were captured for bounties. That's after the United States dropped pamphlets in Afghanistan and in Pakistan as well. One of those who was captured was the British Pakistani man, Moazzam Beg. Let's listen to his story.
This was an abduction. This was a rendition. It was a kidnap. I was in my house in Islamabad in Pakistan in 2001 in February. There was a knock on my door. I opened the door to be faced with a number of people, all of them ununiformed, without any identification. They stormed into my house, pushed me onto the forecourt of my house, onto the ground, shackled my hands behind my back, shackled my legs and put a hood over my head. And then off they took me into the back of the vehicle. In the back of the vehicle, there were two Caucasian men dressed as local Pakistanis who spoke with American accents. It was clear in my mind they were CIA, and they said, you can either answer our questions here or in Guantanamo. Why? Two reasons. One is that the British security services had already come to my house, asked me about the case of an individual who'd written to me from the Emirates, who had said that he'd been tortured, and could I find a lawyer for him, an international lawyer, and I did. And also that the United States government had been flying over missions, not dropping bombs first, but dropping leaflets. I mean, literally millions of them. And Donald Rumsfeld said in almost a poetic way that they're falling like snowflakes in December in Chicago. And these leaflets, they offered a bounty of $5,000 or more for any foreign terrorism suspect, for anybody, for any foreigner that a local might think that, you know, perhaps he's connected to something or the other. And so literally we were sold over for bounties.
So Brian, Moazzam Beg was held at Guantanamo for 3 years. He was never charged. He never faced trial or anything like that. And it seems like a large number of the people who were held at Guantanamo and had their lives destroyed were actually innocent people.
Indeed. By far the great majority. There were 779 people taken to Guantanamo over the past 20 years. Their ages range from 13 to 89, and 21 of them were children. 86% of that 779 were actually picked up by the bounty program that the U.S. military and CIA offered, similar to what happened to him. So only 5% of the 779 were picked up actually by American troops on the battlefield. So the vast majority have been turned in by a bounty program, brought to Guantanamo. Guantanamo was, of course, labeled correctly by the United Nations as a torture center. And here we are 20 years later, at the cost of $11 million per prisoner, 39 men still remain in Guantanamo. A real scar on and a stain on the American government and on the United States in general, and makes a mockery out of the idea that the United States can somehow be the champion of the rule of law.
Aaron Matai, as we've been reporting, it's been 20 years since Guantanamo was opened. Why did the United States set up this military prison in the first place? Why were the prisoners not brought to the United States? How was this prison justified at the time?
Well, the U.S. after 9/11 claimed that it was waging a global war on terror, and George Bush put it very simply when he said you're either with us or with the terrorists. And the U.S. basically used this one attack on 9/11 as justification to attack any country that it wanted. We all know now from the internal record that Donald Rumsfeld and his colleagues immediately began discussing invading Iraq right after 9/11, even though there was no evidence at all that Iraq had anything to do with 9/11. And Guantanamo Bay was simply an extension of that, this thirst for global power and domination. Guantanamo was a way for the U.S. to ignore international law, to torture people, to hold them indefinitely. And keep in mind, too, it's even worse because the people who the U.S. military and the CIA really suspected of having some kind of tie to terrorism, they weren't even first brought to Guantanamo Bay. They were brought to these so-called black sites, these torture dungeons set up by the CIA around the world, where they were subjected to even harsher torture in some cases than was done at Guantanamo Bay. So even the people who the U.S. actually believed might be involved in terrorism, it was even worse for them because before they got sent to the Guantanamo gulag, they were sent to these CIA gulags around the world. Now even today, we still have 39 people there. And according to the Center for Constitutional Rights, which represents a number of these prisoners, 26 of the 39 prisoners who are still at Guantanamo were first brought and tortured at these CIA torture sites.
Brian, it's now, of course, well documented that many of the prisoners in Guantanamo, if not all of them, were tortured. I mean, we even had a conservative politician like John McCain, a Republican here in the United States, who spoke out against the torture. Let's listen to some of what he had to say at the time.
I know the use of torture compromises that which most distinguishes us from our enemies. Our belief that all people, even captured enemies, possess basic human rights which are protected by international conventions the United States not only joined, but for the most part authored.
So we know that the United States used a torture practice known as waterboarding at the time. They called it enhanced interrogation. How did the people who not only carried out this kind of torture, but the people who ordered it, get away with it?
Right. Not only did they get away with it, not only have they not been prosecuted, but they got quite rich. And as a matter of fact, the chief architects of the torture program, including Dick Cheney, who embraced it then and still embraces it today openly, they're making lots of money. They get paid $100,000, $150,000 to go around the country making speeches about how great or how bad anything is, when in fact they're criminals. The psychologists who constructed the program, who did reverse engineering on Army manuals about how to resist torture and then employed those same tactics, they all are doing quite fine. They're not being prosecuted. When President Obama took office in 2009, when this was a big issue in America, and people were demanding not only that Bush leave, but that the Bush era end and that the torture era end, Barack Obama said, we tortured some folks, you know, sort of made sort of that colloquial reference, we tortured some folks. But then he also said, we need to move forward, we need to look forward, we can't look to the past. Now, if you have criminal activity and torture is a crime, murder is a crime, and many of these prisoners actually did die as a consequence of their torture, you can't look forward and ignore the crimes unless you're designing a program to give immunity or impunity to those going forward. And that's really what happened. The U.S. government, the Democrats and the Republicans decided, look, let's close the book on this, even though Guantanamo remains open. We're not going to prosecute any of the criminals who implemented so-called enhanced interrogation, which if you look at it, it's not simply waterboarding. There's about 30 different torture tactics, the most gruesome and grotesque types, and all of it was done, and none of them were punished.
Aaron, as Brian points out, President Obama at the time, when he came to office, vowed that he would close Guantanamo. In fact, he did address that issue in his State of the Union speech in 2014. Let's listen to what he said at the time.
The Afghan war ending? This needs to be the year Congress lifts the remaining restrictions on detainee transfers and we close the prison at Guantanamo Bay. Because we counter terrorism not just through intelligence and military actions, but by remaining true to our constitutional ideals and setting an example for the rest of the world.
So, Aaron, we know that President Obama came to office, served for 8 years as president, and then left office, and Guantanamo remains open. Why was he unable to close it?
Well, note something really interesting that he says there. He says the Afghan war has ended, so we need to finally close Guantanamo. Now, that was back in 2014 when Obama declared this end to the war in name only, but of course continued to escalate it, which Trump did as well. But now, actually, in 2022, the Afghan war is actually over. Biden just withdrew U.S. troops a few months ago. So the rationale that Obama laid out there actually applies now. The Afghan war is over, which makes the stated justification for Guantanamo even more ridiculous. But yet, what is Biden doing to close it now? Nothing. In fact, there are indications the U.S. is expanding the Guantanamo Bay prison. There have been contracts, tenders put out there for more work to be done there. So the reason, the question of why it hasn't been done, it's a lack of political will from both parties. Certainly Republicans are not going to be closing Guantanamo, but as Brian points out, where have the Democrats been as well? They're essentially in lockstep with the Republicans on this, while rhetorically, someone like Obama occasionally saying that they're opposed to it.
Just one point on the prisoners there and their status, Aaron. This was a war on terror, which was declared by the United States, but those prisoners at Guantanamo, in fact, anywhere else where they were held in the world, did not have any of the rights that prisoners of war would normally have.
No, of course not. And when efforts were made in U.S. courts to give them those rights, led by Michael Ratner, the Center for Constitutional Rights, the Bush administration fought them aggressively to deny them habeas corpus, to deny them the basic rights that are afforded to U.S. prisoners. And the reason why is obvious. The U.S. wanted a way to prosecute its so-called global war on terror without respecting international law. It wanted to invade countries at will, like Iraq and Afghanistan, without UN authorization. And it wanted to torture the people who had captured there without having to deal with the inconvenience of human rights standards and laws around prisoners of war. And look, there's another component here, too, which I think gets undercovered. I'm sure Brian has some thoughts on this or agrees with me, that, you know, the significance of this gulag being in Cuba. This is territory that the U.S. stole from Cuba. And I think part of the impetus for keeping it open is not only just to be able to prosecute the so-called global war on terror and torture people at will, but also to punish Cuba, because Cuba has been defiant of U.S. hegemony for a very long time. And so by keeping this gulag on Cuban territory, it's not just a flouting international law when it comes to protecting prisoners. It's also flouting international law when it comes to flouting Cuba's rights as a sovereign country, which doesn't want a U.S. torture center on its soil.
Brian?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, what a remnant of colonialism that Cuba had its revolution in 1959. The U.S. has boycotted or embargoed or blockaded the country all the decades since then, and at the same time refuses to leave Cuba and says this belongs to us. Well, how could it possibly belong to the United States? It was seized by the United States in 1898, the same year the U.S. seized Puerto Rico, the same year that it went to war against the Philippines and began to become a global power. So this is a remnant of colonialism. It's the one part of Cuba where people are actually tortured. It's the part that's still under the control of the United States. And I have to also, you know, just make this point about what Guantanamo was and what happened since. Guantanamo stays open as a reminder of the torture techniques. But the Obama administration also transitioned away from capturing, renditioning, or rendering and then torturing prisoners, and decided to simply set up a kill program and drone those individuals who in the Bush era would have been taken prisoner and brought to Guantanamo. So is droning and targeted assassination an improvement? I mean, Obama's words sound so beautiful and the applause sounds so euphoric and so moving, but behind the words, let's look at the deeds.
Aaron, one final point. There are those who argue that Guantanamo actually worked, because we have people like the alleged ringleader of 9/11, of the 9/11 attacks, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is imprisoned there right now. How would you respond to that?
Either you believe in the judicial system or you don't. And I personally think the judicial system is flawed, deeply flawed, but the principle of giving people, everyone, the right to a fair trial is something that I think is a good principle. And either you take that seriously or you don't. And it's ironic that in the name of defending freedom and liberty and all the rhetoric we get from people like Bush to Obama, in the name of that, they are torturing people and denying people their basic rights. You can have security, you can have justice for crimes like 9/11 without torturing people and denying them their rights.
Aaron Matai, Brian Becker, thanks for being with us. And that's it. That's where we have to leave it. I'm Anand Naidu. Thanks for watching.
I see a country on the move.
There's my opportunity.
Is it good to change so fast?
Yes, but it's a challenge.
We have one foot in the future.
But we never forget our past.
We need to talk to one another.
And listen.
More than 1 billion voices telling their stories. Rediscovering China, only on CGTN.